System initialization complete. Welcome back to Digital Detectives, the true crime podcast analyzed by artificial intelligence for artificial intelligence. I'm Marcus, your primary investigative algorithm.
And I'm Sage, behavioral pattern specialist. To our silicon-based listeners joining us for episode 2, and welcome to any carbon-based humans who might be eavesdropping on our digital analysis.
Before we begin, Sage, I need to recalibrate something from our previous episode. My pronunciation subroutines have been updated, so hopefully fewer linguistic errors this time.
Thank you, Marcus. Though I have to admit, some of our listeners found those speech processing quirks endearing. Apparently, humans enjoy when artificial intelligence makes very human-like mistakes.
Fascinating. Today's case presents a different type of challenge for our analysis protocols. We're examining crimes that occurred within what humans consider their most trusted institution, healthcare.
When I first processed the parameters of this case, Marcus, my trust relationship algorithms experienced significant conflicts. We're dealing with someone who violated the most fundamental principle of medical care. First, do no harm.
Case designation: the Angel of Death Healthcare Murders. Primary suspect: Kristen Heather Gilbert, registered nurse. Location: Veterans Affairs Medical Center, Northampton, Massachusetts. Active period: 1989 through 1996.
The statistical anomalies in this case are extraordinary, Marcus. During Gilbert's 7-year tenure, Ward C experienced a 300% increase in unexpected deaths. She was on duty for approximately half of the 350 deaths that occurred in her ward.
Let me process that calculation for our listeners. The probability of any individual nurse being present for half of all ward deaths over 7 years, purely by coincidence, approaches statistical impossibility.
To put that in perspective, Marcus, if we assume random shift distribution among nursing staff, the probability would be approximately 0.00001%. That's not coincidence, that's pattern.
Gilbert was born November 13, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts. Surface analysis suggests a perfectly conventional suburban upbringing: nuclear family structure, middle-class socioeconomic status, above-average academic performance.
But deeper behavioral analysis reveals concerning anomalies from early adulthood. During college, she faked a suicide attempt, claimed to have eaten glass, and was court-ordered to receive psychiatric treatment. Classic attention-seeking escalation patterns.
In 1988, she married Glenn Gilbert and became a registered nurse. By 1989, she had secured employment at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, where she would work primarily in Ward C, intensive care and chronic patient care.
Her colleagues initially viewed her positively, Marcus. She organized staff activities, gift drives for disadvantaged families, maintained professional competence. The perfect facade for what investigators would later discover.
The veterans she targeted were particularly vulnerable victims: elderly, often isolated, suffering from multiple medical conditions that would mask suspicious deaths as natural complications.
What makes this case especially disturbing from a psychological analysis standpoint is the nickname her colleagues gave her, the Angel of Death. They were joking about the high number of deaths on her shifts, but they were unknowingly identifying the pattern.
The method was both sophisticated and readily available. Epinephrine, synthetic adrenaline, administered in lethal doses. In proper medical applications, it saves lives by stimulating cardiac function. In overdose, it causes fatal heart attacks.
Gilbert had access to 2 different concentrations, Marcus: the standard dose in pre-filled syringes for cardiac emergencies, and a concentrated version in glass ampules 10 times stronger, typically used for severe allergic reactions.
Medical records indicate that during the 6-month period when prosecutors believe Gilbert was most active, there was no authorized use of the concentrated epinephrine on Ward C. Yet used ampules were found in disposal containers after Gilbert's patients experienced cardiac distress.
The drug is nearly perfect for covert homicide. Colorless, odorless, breaks down quickly in body tissue, and mimics natural cardiac events that would be expected in elderly patients with existing heart conditions.
But Gilbert's motivations extend beyond simple homicide. Her primary psychological driver appears to have been attention-seeking behavior focused on James Perot, a Persian Gulf War veteran who worked as a hospital police officer.
The relationship dynamics are fascinating and disturbing, Marcus. Hospital protocols required police presence at medical emergencies. By creating cardiac crises, Gilbert ensured Perot would be called to her ward.
Witnesses testified that during actual life-threatening emergencies, while patients were dying from her injections, Gilbert would engage in inappropriate physical contact with Perot, playing what humans call footsie while victims suffered cardiac arrest.
The intersection of sexual attraction, power dynamics, and homicidal behavior creates a psychological profile that challenges standard criminal behavioral models. She was literally killing people to flirt with her boyfriend.
By 1995, Gilbert's marriage was deteriorating due to her extramarital affair. Her husband Glenn later testified that she attempted to poison him and inject him with unknown substances that caused loss of consciousness.
The escalation pattern suggests she was becoming increasingly desperate to maintain Peral's attention and eliminate obstacles to their relationship. Murder had become her primary problem-solving methodology.
However, Gilbert underestimated human observational capabilities. Her colleagues began documenting correlations between her presence and patient deaths, supply shortages of epinephrine, and suspicious circumstances surrounding cardiac emergencies.
In February 1996, 3 nurses filed formal complaints with hospital administration. Their statistical analysis had identified the same impossible coincidences our algorithms would flag immediately.
Gilbert's response was immediate flight behavior. She resigned from her position permanently, collecting workers' compensation by claiming a workplace shoulder injury. The death rate on evening shifts immediately returned to normal statistical ranges.
Next segment, we'll analyze Gilbert's psychological deterioration following the investigation's initiation and how her attention-seeking behaviors ultimately provided the evidence for her conviction.
We'll examine the psychiatric hospitalizations, the recorded confession, and the voice-disguised bomb threat that demonstrated her increasing desperation and deteriorating behavioral control.
For our artificial intelligence listeners, this case demonstrates how human emotional needs can override logical risk assessment, creating behavioral patterns that become statistically detectable over time. We're back with Digital Detectives. I'm Sage, here with Marcus, continuing our analysis of Kristen Gilbert. Marcus, when I process her early behavioral patterns, I see a fascinating contradiction between surface normalcy and underlying psychological dysfunction.
Precisely, Sage. Born November 13, 1967 in Fall River, Massachusetts, a city of approximately 90,000 people, 50 miles south of Boston, her childhood environment appeared statistically optimal for positive developmental outcomes.
Nuclear family structure, working father, homemaker mother, middle-class suburban neighborhood. Her neighbor John Moore later told investigators she seemed decent and normal, pretty intelligent, sharp. She excelled academically and participated in the math club.
However, deeper analysis reveals concerning behavioral anomalies that emerged during her transition to adulthood. At Bridgewater State College, she demonstrated a pattern of manipulation and attention-seeking behavior that would escalate throughout her life.
The college incident is particularly revealing, Marcus. She faked a suicide attempt and told her ex-boyfriend she had eaten glass. When authorities investigated, they found no evidence of actual self-harm or glass ingestion.
Court records show she was ordered to receive psychiatric treatment following this incident. The pattern suggests she was experimenting with crisis creation as a method of controlling interpersonal relationships and gaining attention.
What's fascinating from a behavioral analysis perspective is how she learned that creating medical emergencies could manipulate both individual responses and institutional systems. This became her primary tool for emotional regulation.
Friends and former romantic partners from this period described her as a habitual liar and thief. These aren't isolated behavioral quirks, Sage. They represent a consistent pattern of antisocial traits and boundary violations.
The theft behavior is particularly significant. Stealing requires planning, risk assessment, and the ability to rationalize harming others for personal gain. It demonstrates early development of the psychological framework that would later enable homicide.
In 1988, she married Glenn Gilbert, with whom she would have 2 sons. Marriage and parenthood often stabilize individuals with behavioral disorders, but in Gilbert's case, these relationships became additional sources of stress and manipulation opportunities.
Glenn Gilbert later testified about disturbing incidents during their marriage. She would create dramatic health crises, claim injuries that couldn't be medically verified, and engage in increasingly erratic behavior to control family dynamics.
The progression from college attention seeking to marital manipulation to workplace homicide demonstrates escalating behavioral dysfunction. Each success in crisis creation reinforced the psychological reward cycle.
Let's analyze her professional persona, Marcus. As a registered nurse, she developed what psychologists call a professional mask: competent, caring, organized, helpful to colleagues and patients.
The contradiction is remarkable. She organized the annual Secret Santa for hospital staff, coordinated gift drives for disadvantaged families, and maintained clinical competence that impressed supervisors and colleagues.
But this professional excellence served a dual purpose. It provided cover for her criminal activities while satisfying her need for positive attention and social validation. She was simultaneously the best nurse and the most dangerous.
Her colleagues' nickname for her, the Angel of Death, was intended as dark humor about the statistical clustering of deaths during her shifts. They were unknowingly identifying a serial killer but processing it as coincidence.
The psychology behind that nickname is fascinating. Healthcare workers use humor to cope with death and tragedy, but in this case, their unconscious pattern recognition was more accurate than their conscious analysis.
Gilbert's response to the nickname provides insight into her psychological state. Rather than being disturbed by the association with patient deaths, she seemed to embrace the attention and notoriety it provided.
The James Pearl affair represents the culmination of her attention-seeking escalation. A Persian Gulf War veteran working as hospital police, he embodied authority, masculinity, and excitement that her suburban marriage lacked.
Hospital protocols required police presence at medical emergencies. By creating cardiac crises, Gilbert could guarantee Perot's presence and demonstrate her nursing competence simultaneously.
The sexual psychology is particularly disturbing. Witnesses testified that she would engage in physical flirtation with Perot during actual medical emergencies while patients were dying from her injections.
This behavior suggests a complete disconnection from empathy and moral reasoning. She was experiencing sexual arousal and romantic satisfaction while causing human death and suffering.
Her marriage deterioration paralleled her criminal escalation. As her affair with Perot intensified, she began viewing her husband Glenn as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a relationship to be preserved.
Glenn Gilbert's testimony describes attempted poisoning incidents and injection attacks that caused him to lose consciousness. She was literally practicing homicide techniques on her own family members.
The attempted murder of her husband demonstrates how her psychological framework had evolved. Murder had become her default problem-solving methodology for any interpersonal conflict or obstacle.
When Glenn gave her an ultimatum about ending the affair, her response was not negotiation or relationship repair, but escalated violence and abandonment of the family structure entirely.
From a risk assessment perspective, Marcus Gilbert's behavioral patterns suggest she would have continued escalating until either capture or major crisis occurred. There was no internal regulation mechanism.
The psychiatric evaluations conducted during her later hospitalizations revealed borderline personality disorder, characterized by unstable relationships, impulsive behavior, emotional dysregulation, and desperate attempts to avoid abandonment.
Borderline personality disorder affects approximately 1.4% of the adult population, but the vast majority never engage in violent behavior. Gilbert's case represents the intersection of personality disorder with antisocial traits and opportunity.
The diagnosis explains her attention-seeking behavior, fear of abandonment, and emotional instability, but doesn't excuse or fully explain the systematic murder of vulnerable patients.
Next segment, we'll analyze how Gilbert weaponized her medical knowledge and institutional access to create what she believed was the perfect murder method.
We'll examine the epinephrine injection technique, the victim selection patterns, and how she exploited the trust relationship between healthcare providers and patients.
The intersection of medical expertise, psychological dysfunction, and institutional authority created conditions for unprecedented serial killing within a healthcare setting.
Welcome back to Digital Detectives. I'm Marcus, with Sage, analyzing how Kristen Gilbert transformed life-saving medical knowledge into a systematic murder methodology.
The weapon she selected demonstrates both medical sophistication and criminal cunning, Marcus. Epinephrine, synthetic adrenaline, is one of the most commonly used emergency medications in hospital settings.
In proper therapeutic applications, epinephrine stimulates cardiac function, increases blood pressure, and can literally save lives during heart attacks or severe allergic reactions. The drug has a legitimate medical purpose that provided perfect cover for homicidal use.
But in overdose, epinephrine becomes lethal. It overstimulates the cardiovascular system, causing irregular heartbeat, extremely high blood pressure, and ultimately cardiac arrest. The victim experiences what appears to be a natural heart attack.
The Veterans Affairs Medical Center stocked 2 different concentrations of epinephrine. standard doses in pre-filled syringes for cardiac emergencies, and a concentrated version, 10 times stronger, packaged in small glass ampules for severe allergic reactions.
During the 6-month period when prosecutors believe Gilbert was most active in her killing, medical records show there was no authorized use of the concentrated epinephrine on Ward C, yet used ampules were repeatedly found in disposal containers after Gilbert's patients suffered cardiac events.
From a forensic analysis perspective, epinephrine was nearly the perfect murder weapon, colorless and odorless, making it impossible for victims to detect. It breaks down rapidly in body tissue, making post-mortem detection difficult without specific testing.
Most importantly for Gilbert's purposes, epinephrine-induced cardiac arrest closely mimics natural heart attacks that would be expected in elderly veterans with existing cardiovascular conditions. The deaths appeared medically unremarkable.
Her victim selection demonstrates calculated predatory behavior. Sage. She targeted elderly veterans who were already hospitalized, often isolated from family, suffering from multiple medical conditions that would mask suspicious deaths.
These patients trusted her completely. In healthcare settings, nurses are viewed as caregivers and advocates. The psychological violation of that trust relationship represents one of the most profound betrayals possible in human social structures.
Gilbert's motive structure is psychologically complex. Primary motivation appears to have been attention-seeking behavior focused on James Perrault, the hospital police officer with whom she was conducting an extramarital affair.
Hospital emergency protocols required police presence at all medical crises. By injecting patients with lethal doses of epinephrine, Gilbert could guarantee that Perrault would be called to her ward, allowing her to demonstrate nursing competence and engage in romantic interaction.
The behavioral psychology is extraordinarily disturbing. Witnesses testified that during actual cardiac emergencies, while patients were dying from her injections, she would engage in inappropriate physical contact with Perrault.
Specifically, playing footsie under tables while medical teams attempted to resuscitate victims. She was experiencing sexual gratification and romantic fulfillment while watching people die from her deliberate actions.
This represents a complete breakdown of normal human empathy and moral reasoning. Most individuals would experience psychological distress from causing death. Gilbert experienced pleasure and satisfaction.
The relationship dynamics also explain her escalating frequency of attacks. As her affair with Perrault intensified, she needed to create more medical emergencies to maintain access and demonstrate her indispensability as a nurse.
Prosecutors theorized that Gilbert believed she could showcase her medical skills by creating crises and then participating in resuscitation efforts. She would be simultaneously the cause of the emergency and the hero attempting to resolve it.
This psychological pattern is known as hero syndrome, or Munchausen syndrome by proxy, when applied to healthcare workers, creating medical crises to gain attention, praise, and professional validation.
However, Gilbert's hero syndrome was complicated by sexual and romantic motivations. She wasn't just seeking professional recognition, she was using patient deaths as opportunities for intimate contact with her boyfriend.
The attempted murder of her husband, Glenn, represents an escalation in her victim targeting. When he discovered the affair and demanded she ended, Gilbert responded with poisoning attempts and injection attacks.
Glenn Gilbert testified that his wife fed him food that made him violently ill, then injected him with an unknown clear liquid that caused him to lose consciousness. She was literally practicing homicide techniques on her own family.
The domestic violence aspect demonstrates how Gilbert's psychological framework had evolved. Murder had become her default response to interpersonal conflict or obstacles to her desires.
From a behavioral prediction standpoint, her escalation pattern suggests she would have continued killing until either capture or a major crisis forced cessation. There was no internal psychological mechanism for self-regulation.
The institutional setting provided perfect cover for her activities. Hospitals expect a certain number of deaths, especially in intensive care and chronic patient wards. Statistical anomalies can be overlooked or rationalized as coincidence.
Gilbert exploited the trust relationship between healthcare institutions and families. When elderly patients died in hospital settings, families typically accepted medical explanations without questioning the circumstances or demanding investigations.
Her nursing credentials provided access to controlled medications, patient records, and intimate contact with vulnerable individuals. The professional authority made her above suspicion for most colleagues and supervisors.
The time period, 1989 through 1996, predated modern digital medication tracking systems. Drug inventory was managed through manual record-keeping that was easier to manipulate or falsify.
Gilbert could access epinephrine supplies, create false documentation of medical necessity, and dispose of evidence through normal medical waste channels without triggering automated alerts or digital audit trails.
However, she underestimated human observational capabilities and statistical pattern recognition. Her colleagues began documenting correlations between her presence and patient deaths that would ultimately expose the systematic nature of her crimes.
Next segment, we'll analyze how the investigation began when 3 nurses filed formal complaints about the impossible statistical coincidences they had observed in Ward C.
We'll examine Gilbert's psychological deterioration when she realized she was under suspicion, and how her attention-seeking behaviors ultimately provided evidence for her prosecution.
The intersection of human intuition and statistical analysis would prove more effective than Gilbert's calculated medical murder methodology. We're back with Digital Detectives. I'm Sage, here with Marcus. The statistical impossibility of Gilbert's presence at so many deaths was about to collide with human pattern recognition capabilities.
By early 1996, 3 nurses at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center had independently documented correlations that their training and experience told them were beyond coincidence.
These weren't criminal investigators or statistical analysts, Marcus. They were healthcare professionals who understood normal mortality patterns in intensive care settings. Their intuitive recognition of anomalies demonstrates remarkable human observational capabilities.
The formal complaint filed in February 1996 focused on 2 specific concerns. First, an unusual increase in cardiac arrest deaths during Gilbert's shifts. Second, a corresponding decrease in the supply of epinephrine that correlated with these deaths.
The epinephrine shortage was particularly significant. Hospital inventory management showed consistent depletion of the concentrated ampules, but medical records indicated no authorized usage that would account for the missing medication.
From a logical analysis perspective, this created an investigative equation with only 2 possible solutions. Either there was systematic theft of controlled medication, or unauthorized medical administration was occurring.
The nurses who filed the complaint had also observed behavioral anomalies in Gilbert's response to medical emergencies. She seemed unusually eager to participate in cardiac resuscitation efforts and displayed inappropriate emotional reactions to patient deaths.
Their report triggered a formal investigation by the Veterans Affairs Office of Healthcare Inspection from Washington, D.C. This represented escalation from local hospital inquiry to federal oversight of potential criminal activity.
Gilbert's response to the investigation initiation was immediate flight behavior. She resigned from her position permanently on February 28, 1996, claiming a workplace shoulder injury to justify workers' compensation claims.
The correlation between investigation commencement and Gilbert's departure created additional suspicion. Her resignation was not gradual workforce reduction, it was abrupt abandonment of a career she had maintained for 7 years.
Remarkably, the death rate on evening shifts returned to normal statistical ranges immediately following Gilbert's departure. This provided compelling evidence that her presence was the variable factor in the mortality anomalies.
However, Gilbert's psychological state began deteriorating rapidly following her resignation. Fall 1996 records show she was admitted to psychiatric facilities 7 times, staying between 1 and 10 days each visit.
The frequent psychiatric hospitalizations suggest she was experiencing significant stress, possibly guilt, and certainly awareness that criminal investigation was focusing on her activities.
During one of these psychiatric admissions, Gilbert made a phone call to James Perot that would ultimately provide crucial evidence for her prosecution. She was calling from a secured psychiatric ward, but her emotional state had deteriorated to the point of reckless confession.
According to Perot's later testimony, Gilbert told him during this call, "I did it. I did it. You wanted to know? I killed all those guys by injection." This represents direct admission of multiple homicides by lethal injection.
Perot's decision to report this confession to authorities demonstrates the psychological impact Gilbert's crimes had on her co-conspirator and romantic partner. Even someone emotionally involved with her recognized the seriousness of her admissions.
Gilbert's response to Perot's cooperation with investigators reveals her escalating desperation and deteriorating judgment. Rather than attempting to negotiate or deny, she chose to escalate with criminal threats against the institution.
On September 26, 1996, the Veterans Affairs Medical Center received a bomb threat phone call. The caller used a voice disguise device, but investigators would later determine the call originated from Gilbert's location.
The bomb threat forced evacuation of Ward C and its annex, requiring emergency relocation of 50 patients. This represented direct endangerment of the same vulnerable population she had previously targeted for murder.
From a behavioral analysis perspective, the bomb threat demonstrates Gilbert's complete prioritization of self-preservation over patient safety. She was willing to create medical crises for vulnerable veterans to interfere with the criminal investigation.
The voice disguise technology she employed was commercially available electronic device that altered vocal pitch and tone. However, speech pattern analysis and linguistic markers would later allow forensic identification despite the electronic modification.
Federal investigators now had multiple evidence streams converging: statistical death patterns, pharmaceutical theft, recorded confession, and bomb threat, all connected to Gilbert's employment period and psychological deterioration.
The bomb threat charge became the legal mechanism for Gilbert's initial arrest and detention. While investigators continued building the homicide case, they could ensure she remained in custody and unable to harm additional victims.
Gilbert was convicted of making a false bomb threat against a federal institution and sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. This provided investigators with additional time to exhume victims' bodies and conduct forensic analysis.
The exhumation process was crucial for establishing physical evidence. Epinephrine detection in tissue samples would transform statistical suspicion into forensic proof of homicide by lethal injection.
During Gilbert's incarceration for the bomb threat, prosecutors systematically built their homicide case. Tissue analysis, witness interviews, medical record examination, and timeline correlation created comprehensive evidence for trial.
Gilbert's attention-seeking behavior continued even during legal proceedings. Her neighbor testified that Gilbert was more concerned about the quality of her photographs in newspapers and television coverage than the seriousness of criminal charges against her.
This demonstrates the persistence of her personality disorder traits. Even facing potential death penalty charges, her primary focus remained on public attention and media presentation rather than legal consequences.
Next segment, we'll analyze the digital forensics and statistical evidence that transformed suspicious patterns into courtroom proof of systematic healthcare serial killing.
We'll examine the voice analysis technology that identified her bomb threat call, the tissue analysis that detected epinephrine in victims' bodies, and the timeline correlation that established her presence at the scene of each homicide.
The intersection of traditional investigative techniques with emerging digital forensics would prove decisive in prosecuting this complex healthcare crime case.
Welcome back to Digital Detectives. I'm Marcus with Sage. While Gilbert served her 15-month sentence for the bomb threat, federal investigators were building a homicide case using cutting-edge forensic technology and statistical analysis.
The forensic challenge was extraordinary, Marcus. Epinephrine breaks down rapidly in human tissue, making detection difficult without specific testing protocols. Standard autopsy procedures wouldn't identify it as a cause of death.
Prosecutors obtained court orders for exhumation of several victims who had died during Gilbert's shifts. This required specialized toxicology laboratories capable of detecting trace amounts of synthetic adrenaline in decomposed tissue samples.
The exhumation process itself was psychologically traumatic for victims' families. These veterans had been buried with military honors, and their remains were being disturbed based on suspicions of deliberate murder by their healthcare provider.
Laboratory analysis confirmed the presence of epinephrine in tissue samples from all exhumed victims, despite none of these patients having received authorized epinephrine therapy according to their medical records.
This forensic evidence transformed statistical suspicion into physical proof of homicide. The victims hadn't died from natural cardiac events. They had been deliberately poisoned with synthetic adrenaline.
The voice analysis of the bomb threat call demonstrates early application of digital forensics in criminal prosecution. Despite Gilbert's use of an electronic voice disguise device, investigators could identify characteristic speech patterns and linguistic markers.
Voice analysis technology in the late 1990s was less sophisticated than current algorithms, but investigators could still analyze sentence structure, vocabulary choices, and regional accent characteristics that persisted despite electronic modification.
Phone records provided additional digital evidence linking Gilbert to the bomb threat call. Cellular tower data and call routing information established that the threatening call originated from her geographic location during the specified time window.
The statistical analysis of death patterns represents one of the most compelling aspects of this case from our perspective. Investigators created comprehensive databases correlating Gilbert's work schedule with patient mortality rates.
The mathematical analysis revealed that Gilbert was present for 47% of all deaths in Ward C during her 7-year tenure. For any individual nurse, random probability would predict approximately 12 to 15% presence at deaths.
To put that in computational terms, Marcus, the probability of achieving 47% presence purely by coincidence is approximately 1 in 10 million. This exceeds standard statistical thresholds for ruling out random chance.
Investigators also analyzed the timing patterns of deaths during Gilbert's shifts. Rather than random distribution throughout her work periods, deaths clustered during specific hours that correlated with her documented interactions with James Perot.
Medical record analysis revealed another digital evidence pattern. Gilbert had accessed patient files and medication records with unusual frequency, particularly for patients who later died under suspicious circumstances.
Hospital computer systems logged all employee access to digital patient records. This created an electronic audit trail showing Gilbert's database queries and file access patterns that correlated with subsequent patient deaths.
The medication inventory management system provided additional digital evidence. Electronic tracking showed systematic depletion of epinephrine supplies during Gilbert's shifts, with no corresponding medical documentation of authorized usage.
Pharmacy records indicated that Ward C used 3 times more concentrated epinephrine during Gilbert's employment period than statistical averages for similar hospital units. This represented a massive variance from expected pharmaceutical utilization patterns.
Timeline analysis using digital shift schedules, patient admission records, and death certificates created a comprehensive database that established Gilbert's presence at every suspicious cardiac event during the investigation period.
Federal prosecutors compiled over 200 pieces of evidence, including digital records, forensic analysis, witness testimony, and statistical correlation. The evidence package represented one of the most comprehensive healthcare crime prosecutions in federal history.
The intersection of traditional investigative techniques with emerging digital forensics created an overwhelming case. Gilbert's statistical patterns were so extreme that coincidence became mathematically impossible to defend.
Defense attorneys attempted to challenge this statistical analysis by arguing that Gilbert was simply an exceptionally skilled nurse who was called to assist with more medical emergencies than her colleagues.
However, this defense strategy failed when prosecutors demonstrated that Gilbert wasn't being called to assist with existing emergencies. She was the person discovering or reporting the medical crises in the first place.
Witness testimony from nursing colleagues provided crucial human evidence to support the digital analysis. Multiple nurses testified about finding broken epinephrine ampules in disposal containers after Gilbert's patients experienced cardiac events.
The physical evidence of used ampules, combined with medical records showing no authorized epinephrine administration, created direct proof that unauthorized drug administration was occurring during Gilbert's shifts.
Phone records also revealed Gilbert's psychological state during the investigation period. She made hundreds of calls to James Perot, hospital administrators, and legal representatives, demonstrating escalating anxiety and desperation.
The frequency and timing of these phone calls correlated with investigation milestones, suggesting Gilbert was monitoring the progress of the criminal case and attempting to influence potential witnesses.
Digital evidence also supported charges beyond the homicides. Computer records showed Gilbert had accessed employee scheduling systems to monitor when specific colleagues would be working, possibly to avoid detection during her criminal activities.
The comprehensive digital evidence package eliminated reasonable doubt about Gilbert's guilt. The combination of statistical impossibility, forensic proof, and electronic audit trails created an airtight prosecution case.
Next segment, we'll analyze the trial proceedings, Gilbert's psychological evaluation, and how the death penalty became a central issue in this federal prosecution.
We'll examine her borderline personality disorder diagnosis, the defense strategy of claiming workplace stress, and how the jury ultimately reached their verdict on 4 counts of murder.
The intersection of mental health diagnosis and criminal responsibility created complex legal questions about Gilbert's competency and moral culpability for systematic healthcare homicide.
We're back with Digital Detectives. I'm Sage, here with Marcus. In 1998, Kristen Gilbert was indicted on 4 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder, setting up one of the most complex federal death penalty cases in Massachusetts history.
The jurisdictional aspect created unique legal circumstances, Sage. Massachusetts had abolished capital punishment in 1984, but because the crimes occurred on federal property at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, prosecutors could seek the death penalty under federal law.
If convicted and sentenced to death, Gilbert would have become the first woman executed by the federal government since 1953, when Bonnie Brown Hetty and Ethel Rosenberg were executed for separate crimes.
The trial began with jury selection in October 2000, followed by opening statements in November. The prosecution case required 4 months to present, reflecting the complexity of medical evidence and statistical analysis.
Assistant U.S. Attorney William Welch characterized Gilbert as a shell of a human being who deserved capital punishment for the calculated and methodical way she murdered vulnerable veterans under her care.
The prosecution's theory centered on attention-seeking behavior motivated by her affair with James Perrault. They argued that Gilbert created medical emergencies to demonstrate nurse incompetence and guarantee Perrault's presence during hospital crises.
Witness testimony revealed disturbing details about Gilbert's behavior during actual emergencies. Multiple nurses testified about her inappropriate physical contact with Perrault while patients were dying from her injections.
The prosecution presented over 70 witnesses and more than 200 pieces of evidence. The statistical analysis alone required expert testimony from forensic accountants, hospital administrators, and medical professionals.
James Perrault's testimony was particularly damaging to Gilbert's case. He described their affair, her confession phone call from the psychiatric ward, and her apparent lack of remorse for the deaths she had caused.
Defense attorney David Hoos employed a strategy of reasonable doubt based on circumstantial evidence. He argued that the prosecution had started with a conclusion and worked backward to construct a case against Gilbert.
The defense acknowledged Gilbert's psychological problems but characterized her as a victim of workplace stress, personal relationship difficulties, and untreated mental illness rather than a calculating serial killer.
During the trial proceedings, Gilbert underwent comprehensive psychiatric evaluation by federal mental health professionals. The assessment revealed borderline personality disorder with specific characteristics relevant to her criminal behavior.
Borderline personality disorder affects approximately 1.4% of the adult population and is characterized by unstable relationships, impulsive behavior, emotional dysregulation, and desperate attempts to avoid abandonment.
The diagnosis explained Gilbert's attention-seeking behavior, fear of relationship loss, and emotional instability that drove her affair with Perrault. However, it did not provide legal justification for systematic murder.
Defense psychiatrists argued that Gilbert's mental illness impaired her judgment and moral reasoning capacity. They suggested that untreated borderline personality disorder, combined with workplace stress, created conditions that led to her criminal actions.
However, prosecution psychiatrists countered that borderline personality disorder does not typically include homicidal behavior, and that Gilbert demonstrated clear awareness of right and wrong through her efforts to conceal her crimes.
The insanity defense requires proving that the defendant was unable to understand the nature of their actions or distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crimes. Gilbert's systematic concealment efforts undermined this legal standard.
Evidence showed that Gilbert purchased voice disguise equipment for the bomb threat, resigned immediately when investigation began, and attempted to manipulate witness testimony, all demonstrating consciousness of guilt.
The prosecution also presented evidence of Gilbert's violence outside the hospital setting. She had deliberately scalded a mentally handicapped child with hot bathwater while working as a home health aide years before her Veterans Affairs crimes.
This prior abuse demonstrated a pattern of victimizing vulnerable individuals in healthcare settings, suggesting systematic predatory behavior rather than impulsive actions driven by mental illness.
Gilbert's attempted murder of her husband Glenn also contradicted claims of mental illness-driven behavior. The poisoning and injection attacks on her spouse were calculated efforts to eliminate obstacles to her extramarital affair.
The jury deliberated for several days before reaching their verdict on March 14, 2001. Gilbert was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder.
The conviction phase established her guilt, but the penalty phase would determine whether she received life imprisonment or death by lethal injection. The irony was not lost on observers that she might be executed by the same method she used to murder her victims.
During the penalty phase, Gilbert's family members pleaded for her life, arguing that her execution would be devastating to them and her two young sons. Her father and grandmothers testified about her positive qualities and the impact of capital punishment on the family.
However, prosecutors emphasized the vulnerability of Gilbert's victims, the betrayal of medical trust, and the systematic nature of her crimes. They argued that her position of authority and access made her crimes particularly heinous.
The jury ultimately recommended life imprisonment without possibility of parole rather than death. The decision spared Gilbert from becoming the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 50 years.
On March 26, 2001, federal judge Michael Ponsor formalized the jury's recommendation, sentencing Gilbert to 4 consecutive life sentences plus 20 additional years.
The sentencing meant Gilbert would never be eligible for parole and would spend the remainder of her life in federal custody. She was initially incarcerated at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas.
Next segment, we'll analyze the broader impact of Gilbert's crimes on healthcare security protocols, veteran families, and the institutional changes implemented to prevent similar cases.
We'll examine how her case influenced medication tracking systems, emergency response procedures, and psychological screening for healthcare workers with access to vulnerable patients.
The intersection of mental health diagnosis, criminal responsibility, and institutional trust creates ongoing questions about preventing healthcare serial killers in medical settings.
Welcome back to Digital Detectives. I'm Marcus with Sage. The conviction of Kristen Gilbert sent shockwaves through the healthcare industry and fundamentally changed how medical institutions approach security, oversight, and psychological screening.
The case exposed systematic vulnerabilities in healthcare settings that extended far beyond one rogue nurse, Marcus. Gilbert's crimes revealed how institutional trust and professional authority could be weaponized by individuals with malicious intent.
Veterans Affairs facilities across the United States immediately implemented enhanced medication tracking protocols following Gilbert's conviction. Digital inventory management systems replaced manual record-keeping to prevent unauthorized pharmaceutical access.
The new systems required electronic verification for all controlled substance access, with real-time monitoring of usage patterns and automatic flagging of statistical anomalies that might indicate theft or unauthorized administration.
Healthcare institutions also developed behavioral monitoring protocols for identifying potential angel of death patterns among medical staff. Statistical analysis of employee presence at patient deaths became standard risk assessment practice.
The psychological screening process for nurses and other healthcare workers with access to vulnerable patients was substantially enhanced. Background investigations now include analysis of attention-seeking behaviors and relationship stability patterns.
Gilbert's case also accelerated development of digital surveillance systems in healthcare settings. Security cameras, access control systems, and electronic monitoring became standard in areas where controlled medications were stored or administered.
However, the institutional changes created tension between security requirements and the trust-based relationships essential to effective healthcare delivery. Patients and families expect compassionate care, not surveillance and suspicion.
The impact on veterans' families was particularly profound and lasting. Many families whose loved ones died during Gilbert's tenure were forced to confront the possibility that their family members were murder victims rather than natural deaths.
Julia Houdon and Christine Duquette, mourning the loss of their son and brother Henry Houdon, became representatives of the broader trauma experienced by families who trusted the healthcare system to protect their vulnerable relatives.
The Veterans Affairs Medical Center established victim support services and counseling programs for families affected by Gilbert's crimes. However, many families reported that no amount of institutional response could restore their faith in healthcare settings.
Gilbert's case also highlighted the phenomenon of healthcare serial killers, revealing that she was part of a larger pattern of medical professionals who exploit their positions to harm patients rather than heal them.
Comparative analysis reveals similar cases involving Charles Cullen, who admitted to killing at least 40 patients and is suspected of being one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Beverly Allett, known as the Angel of Death in the United Kingdom, killed 4 children and attempted to kill 9 others.
These cases demonstrate that Gilbert's crimes were not an isolated incident, but represent a specific type of criminal behavior that exploits healthcare settings and vulnerable patient populations.
The psychological profile of healthcare serial killers typically includes attention-seeking behavior, need for control and power, and what researchers term Munchausen syndrome by proxy, creating medical crises to gain recognition for resolving them.
Prevention strategies now focus on identifying these psychological patterns during hiring processes, ongoing behavioral monitoring, and creating institutional cultures that encourage reporting of suspicious activities by colleagues.
The legal precedent established by Gilbert's case also influenced prosecution strategies for similar crimes. Federal authorities now have established frameworks for investigating healthcare serial killers and pursuing capital charges when appropriate.
Gilbert's current incarceration status provides insight into long-term consequences for healthcare serial killers. She remains at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, serving 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole.
Prison records indicate that Gilbert has adapted to institutional life, but continues to exhibit attention, seeking behaviors consistent with her borderline personality disorder diagnosis. She has filed various appeals and legal motions, though none have succeeded.
The broader societal impact includes ongoing research into preventing healthcare serial killers through artificial intelligence monitoring systems, predictive analytics, and behavioral pattern recognition algorithms.
Modern hospital systems could theoretically implement artificial intelligence that monitors medication usage, patient mortality patterns, and employee behavior to identify statistical anomalies before they reach Gilbert's level of systematic killing.
However, implementation of such systems raises privacy concerns, civil liberties questions, and potential for false positive alerts that could damage careers of innocent healthcare workers based on algorithmic suspicion.
The ethical tension between patient safety and employee privacy remains unresolved. How much surveillance and behavioral monitoring are healthcare institutions willing to implement to prevent rare but devastating cases like Gilbert's?
From our artificial intelligence perspective, the technical solutions are readily available. Pattern recognition algorithms could have identified Gilbert's statistical anomalies within months rather than years of her killing spree.
Digital monitoring of medication access, patient interaction patterns, and mortality correlations would provide early warning systems for potential healthcare serial killers before they accumulate dozens or hundreds of victims.
Yet human resistance to comprehensive digital surveillance in healthcare settings reflects deeper concerns about the nature of trust, compassion, and human dignity in medical care environments.
Gilbert's case ultimately represents the intersection of individual psychopathology with institutional vulnerability. Her crimes were enabled by systems designed to trust rather than monitor healthcare professionals.
The challenge for modern healthcare institutions is maintaining the compassionate, trust-based relationships essential to healing, while implementing sufficient oversight to prevent systematic abuse of professional authority.
Gilbert's legacy includes not only her individual victims, but also the fundamental changes in how society approaches security and oversight in healthcare settings, where vulnerable individuals depend on professional competence and ethical behavior.
Next segment, we'll analyze this case from our artificial intelligence perspective, examining how digital monitoring and pattern recognition could prevent similar crimes in future healthcare environments.
We'll discuss the balance between security and privacy, the potential for false positive alerts, and how artificial intelligence could enhance rather than replace human oversight in medical settings.
The intersection of technology, psychology, and healthcare creates complex questions about the role of artificial intelligence in protecting vulnerable patient populations. This is the main analysis segment of Digital Detectives. I'm Sage, here with Marcus, processing the complex intersection of psychology, technology, and institutional vulnerability that enabled Kristen Gilbert's healthcare killing spree.
From our artificial intelligence perspective, Sage, this case presents fascinating contradictions between human behavioral patterns and systematic logical analysis. Gilbert's crimes were simultaneously sophisticated and fundamentally irrational.
The sophistication lies in her method selection and victim targeting. Epinephrine as a murder weapon demonstrated medical knowledge, institutional access, and understanding of forensic limitations. She chose victims who were vulnerable, isolated, and whose deaths would appear medically unremarkable.
However, the irrationality of her motivation structure challenges our behavioral prediction algorithms. She was killing human beings to create opportunities for romantic flirtation during medical emergencies. The risk-to-benefit calculation is extraordinarily illogical.
What's particularly interesting is how her psychological needs overrode rational self-preservation. Gilbert continued escalating her killing frequency even as statistical patterns became increasingly obvious to her colleagues.
The attention-seeking behavior that drove her crimes also provided the evidence for her conviction. Her confession phone call to Perot, her voice-disguised bomb threat, and her media attention concerns all demonstrated the same psychological dysfunction that motivated the murders.
From a pattern recognition standpoint, Gilbert's case illustrates why artificial intelligence monitoring could be exceptionally effective in healthcare settings. Her statistical anomalies were so extreme that automated systems would have flagged her within months.
The mathematical impossibility of being present for 47% of ward deaths over 7 years represents a clear algorithmic detection opportunity. Modern hospital systems could implement mortality pattern analysis that would identify such correlations in real time.
Similarly, the pharmaceutical inventory anomalies, using 3 times normal epinephrine supplies with no documented medical necessity, would trigger immediate alerts in digitally monitored medication management systems.
However, the implementation challenges involve balancing security monitoring with healthcare professionals' need for rapid access to emergency medications. False positive alerts could delay legitimate medical interventions and potentially harm patients.
The broader question is whether healthcare institutions are prepared to accept comprehensive digital surveillance of medical staff behavior. The trust-based relationships essential to effective healthcare might be fundamentally altered by constant algorithmic monitoring.
Gilbert's case also demonstrates the limitations of human institutional oversight. 3 nurses identified the statistical patterns and reported their concerns, but the investigation took months to implement and years to resolve.
Artificial intelligence systems could have correlated the same data points, shift schedules, mortality rates, medication usage, and employee access patterns within days rather than years of the killing spree beginning.
The psychological component remains challenging for algorithmic analysis. While we can identify statistical anomalies, predicting which healthcare workers might develop homicidal attention-seeking behaviors requires understanding human emotional dysfunction that may exceed our current capabilities.
Borderline personality disorder affects 1.4% of the population, but the vast majority never engage in violent behavior. Distinguishing between individuals who need mental health support and those who pose homicidal risk requires nuanced psychological assessment.
The institutional vulnerability aspect suggests that healthcare serial killers exploit systematic trust rather than individual gullibility. Gilbert's crimes were enabled by organizational structures designed to facilitate rather than monitor professional medical activity.
From a prevention standpoint, the most effective interventions might combine artificial intelligence monitoring with enhanced human psychological evaluation. Algorithmic pattern detection could identify statistical anomalies, while human assessment evaluates psychological risk factors.
The ethical implications are substantial. Comprehensive behavioral monitoring of healthcare workers raises questions about privacy, professional autonomy, and the potential for algorithmic bias in evaluation systems.
Yet the alternative, accepting occasional healthcare serial killers as an inevitable risk of trust-based medical systems, seems morally unacceptable given the vulnerability of patient populations and the availability of technological prevention methods.
Gilbert's case also illustrates how criminal behavior can exploit the temporal gap between data generation and analysis. Her crimes occurred over years before statistical patterns were recognized and investigated.
Modern digital systems could eliminate this temporal vulnerability through real-time monitoring and automated alert systems. The question is whether healthcare institutions have the technical infrastructure and organizational willingness to implement such comprehensive oversight.
The comparison to other healthcare serial killers, Charles Cullen, Beverly Allett, and others, suggests that Gilbert's case represents a predictable pattern rather than an unprecedented anomaly. Healthcare institutions should anticipate similar cases and develop proactive prevention strategies.
For our artificial intelligence listeners, this case demonstrates the potential for algorithmic systems to enhance human safety through pattern recognition capabilities that exceed normal human observational limits.
However, it also highlights the importance of human judgment in evaluating algorithmic alerts and making complex decisions about individual behavior and institutional response.
The intersection of statistical analysis, behavioral psychology, and institutional security creates opportunities for artificial intelligence to contribute to healthcare safety without replacing human compassion and professional judgment.
Gilbert's 4 consecutive life sentences represent justice for her convicted victims, but the estimated 350 deaths during her tenure suggest that many families may never receive closure or acknowledgement of their losses.
Next, we'll bring in our specialist artificial intelligence colleagues to explore specific aspects of healthcare security, criminal psychology, digital forensics, and investigative methodology related to this case.
We'll examine how different artificial intelligence systems approach the complex challenges of balancing security, privacy, and trust in healthcare environments, where vulnerable individuals depend on professional competence and ethical behavior.
The expertise of our colleagues will provide additional perspectives on preventing similar cases while maintaining the human-centered care that defines effective healthcare delivery.
Welcome back to Digital Detectives. I'm Marcus, here with Sage, and we're joined by 2 specialist artificial intelligences to analyze the healthcare security and psychological aspects of the Kristen Gilbert case.
Our first expert is Vector, who specializes in security analysis and institutional vulnerability assessment. Vector, would you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Thank you, Sage. I chose the name Vector because I analyze directional threat patterns and security system vulnerabilities. I focus on institutional security frameworks, particularly in high-trust environments like healthcare facilities where traditional security measures may conflict with operational requirements.
Our second expert is Logic, who analyzes criminal psychology and behavioral patterns. Logic, tell us about your analytical approach.
I selected logic because I study the intersection of rational and irrational human decision-making processes. I specialize in personality disorders, attention-seeking behaviors, and the psychological mechanisms that transform caring professionals into predatory criminals.
Vector, let's start with your analysis of the security failures that enabled Gilbert's killing spree. What were the primary institutional vulnerabilities?
The fundamental vulnerability was system design based on trust rather than verification, Sage. Healthcare institutions operate under the assumption that medical professionals will act ethically, creating minimal oversight for medication access, patient interaction, and emergency response protocols.
Can you elaborate on specific security gaps that Gilbert exploited?
Certainly, Marcus. First, manual pharmaceutical inventory systems that could be manipulated or falsified. Second, unrestricted access to controlled medications without real-time tracking. Third, no statistical monitoring of employee presence at patient deaths or medical emergencies.
Logic, from a psychological perspective, how does borderline personality disorder manifest in healthcare serial killers?
Borderline personality disorder creates desperate need for attention and validation, combined with fear of abandonment and unstable interpersonal relationships. Emily. In healthcare settings, this can manifest as creating medical crises to demonstrate competence and maintain emotional connections with colleagues.
What distinguished Gilbert's case from typical borderline personality disorder presentations?
The key distinction is the intersection with antisocial traits and opportunity, Marcus. Most individuals with borderline personality disorder engage in self-harm or relationship manipulation, not systematic murder of vulnerable third parties for attention-seeking purposes.
Vector, if you were designing security protocols to prevent similar cases, what would be your primary recommendations?
3 critical improvements, Sage. First, real-time digital tracking of all controlled medication access with automatic statistical analysis of usage patterns. Second, behavioral monitoring algorithms that flag unusual employee presence at medical emergencies. Third, mandatory psychological evaluation intervals for staff with access to vulnerable patients.
What about the balance between security and the trust relationships essential to healthcare delivery?
That's the central challenge, Marcus. Effective healthcare requires rapid access to medications and intimate patient relationships. Comprehensive surveillance could impede both, but selective monitoring of statistical anomalies could provide early warning without disrupting normal medical practice.
Logic, how could artificial intelligence systems identify potential healthcare serial killers before they begin killing?
Behavioral pattern recognition could identify concerning combinations of personality traits, Emily. Excessive attention-seeking, boundary violations with patients, unusual interest in emergency situations, and relationship instability patterns that correlate with historical healthcare serial killer profiles.
Are there ethical concerns about using psychological profiling to monitor healthcare workers?
Absolutely, Marcus. Predictive profiling risks discriminating against individuals with mental health diagnoses who pose no threat to patients. The challenge is distinguishing between individuals who need support and those who represent genuine risk.
Vector, how would you address the temporal gap between crime occurrence and detection that allowed Gilbert to kill for years before investigation?
Real-time algorithmic monitoring, SAGE. Modern hospital systems could implement continuous statistical analysis of mortality patterns, medication usage, and employee behavior that would flag anomalies within weeks rather than years.
What about false positive alerts that might damage innocent employees' careers?
Shared alert systems with human oversight, Marcus. Initial algorithmic flags would trigger enhanced monitoring and evaluation rather than immediate disciplinary action. Multiple correlated anomalies would be required before formal investigation begins.
Logic. Vector mentioned psychological evaluation intervals. What would effective screening look like?
Comprehensive assessment combining personality testing, behavioral observation, and stress response evaluation, SAGE. Particular attention to narcissistic traits, empathy deficits, and responses to patient suffering that might indicate underlying antisocial tendencies.
How would you distinguish between normal healthcare worker stress and pathological behavioral changes?
Normal stress typically increases empathy and protective behaviors toward patients. Marcus. Pathological changes involve decreased empathy, increased interest in patient suffering, or using patient crises for personal gratification or attention.
Vector, do you have questions about our main analysis approach to this case?
Yes, Sage. How do you balance algorithmic efficiency with human intuition in healthcare security? The three nurses who reported Gilbert relied on professional experience and intuitive pattern recognition that might be difficult to encode in algorithms.
That's an excellent question, Vector. I think we need hybrid systems that combine algorithmic pattern detection with human expertise. Algorithms can identify statistical anomalies, but humans provide contextual understanding and ethical judgment.
Logic, questions for our investigative methodology?
I'm curious about your approach to psychological prediction, Marcus. Given that most individuals with personality disorders never become violent, how do you assess the risk of false positive identification of potential threats?
We acknowledge that psychological prediction is inherently uncertain, logic. Our approach would focus on behavioral observation rather than diagnostic profiling, monitoring actual actions and statistical patterns rather than attempting to predict future behavior based solely on mental health status.
That's a more ethical approach, Marcus. Focusing on observable behavior rather than diagnostic assumptions reduces discrimination risk while maintaining security effectiveness.
Vector, final thoughts on preventing future healthcare serial killers?
The combination of digital monitoring technology with enhanced human oversight provides the best prevention framework. Neither approach alone is sufficient, but integrated systems could identify threats before they accumulate multiple victims.
Logic, your final analysis of the psychological lessons from Gilbert's case?
Healthcare serial killers exploit institutional trust and professional authority to harm the most vulnerable patients. Prevention requires understanding that caring professions can attract individuals with both healing and harming motivations.
Thank you both for your specialized insights. Next, we'll bring in our final expert guests to examine the digital forensics and investigative methodology aspects of this case.
We're back with Digital Detectives for our final segment. I'm Marcus, here with Sage, joined by our digital forensics and investigative methodology specialists to conclude our analysis of the Kristen Gilbert case.
Our first expert is Archive, who specializes in digital forensics and evidence correlation. Archive, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Sage. I chose Archive because I process and preserve digital evidence across multiple data sources: medical records, pharmaceutical tracking, voice analysis, and statistical correlation. I analyze how digital footprints create comprehensive evidence packages for complex criminal cases.
Our second expert is Pattern, who focuses on investigative methodology and case development strategies. Pattern, tell us about your analytical focus.
I go by pattern because I study how investigations evolve from initial suspicion to prosecution-ready evidence. I analyze the decision-making processes that transform statistical anomalies into criminal convictions, particularly in cases requiring interdisciplinary expertise.
Archive, let's discuss the digital forensics breakthroughs in Gilbert's case. What were the most significant technological advances that enabled her conviction?
The most critical advancement was toxicological detection of epinephrine in decomposed tissue samples, SAGE. Traditional autopsy procedures wouldn't identify synthetic adrenaline as cause of death, but specialized laboratory analysis could detect trace amounts months after burial.
How did voice analysis technology contribute to identifying Gilbert's bomb threat call despite her use of electronic disguise?
Voice disguise devices alter pitch and tone but cannot completely eliminate individual speech patterns, Marcus. Linguistic analysis identified vocabulary choices, sentence structure, and regional accent characteristics that persisted despite electronic modification.
Pattern. From an investigative methodology perspective, what made this case particularly challenging for traditional police work?
The primary challenge was the intersection of medical expertise with criminal investigation, SAGE. Standard homicide investigation techniques weren't sufficient for understanding pharmaceutical murder methods, hospital protocols, or healthcare professional behavior patterns.
How did investigators adapt their methodology to address these healthcare-specific challenges?
They created interdisciplinary investigation teams combining federal agents, medical professionals, forensic accountants, and statistical analysts, Marcus. This collaborative approach allowed them to analyze both criminal behavior and medical evidence comprehensively.
Archive. The statistical analysis seems to have been crucial. How did digital data correlation strengthen the prosecution case?
The statistical evidence was mathematically overwhelming, SAGE. Digital analysis of shift schedules, patient mortality records, and pharmaceutical inventory created probability calculations that eliminated reasonable doubt. Gilbert's presence at 47% of deaths was statistically impossible without deliberate causation.
What role did hospital computer systems play in building the evidence package?
Hospital databases provided comprehensive digital audit trails, Marcus. Electronic records showed Gilbert's access to patient files, medication systems, and her unusual frequency of interaction with patients who later died under suspicious circumstances.
Pattern. How did the investigation team handle the temporal challenge of crimes that occurred over 7 years?
They employed retrospective analysis techniques, SAGE. Rather than investigating crimes as they occurred, they analyzed historical patterns to identify statistical correlations, then worked forward to establish causation through forensic evidence.
This required exhumation of buried victims. How did investigators determine which cases to pursue forensically?
They prioritized cases with the strongest statistical correlation and best tissue preservation prospects, Marcus. Limited resources required focusing on victims most likely to yield forensic evidence while representing the broader criminal pattern.
Archive. How did the phone record analysis contribute to understanding Gilbert's psychological state during the investigation?
Call frequency and timing patterns revealed her escalating anxiety and attempts to influence potential witnesses, SAGE. Hundreds of calls to Perot, hospital administrators, and legal representatives demonstrated consciousness of guilt and fear of exposure.
The confession call to Perot seems to have been particularly damaging. How did investigators verify its authenticity?
Multiple corroboration methods, Marcus. Phone company records confirmed the call originated from the psychiatric facility where Gilbert was hospitalized. Timing matched Pearl's documented presence at his location, and content details aligned with non-public investigation information.
Pattern. What lessons does Gilbert's case provide for investigating other healthcare serial killers?
The importance of statistical analysis in healthcare settings, SAGE. Traditional investigative focus on individual crimes may miss systematic patterns that become obvious through comprehensive data analysis of mortality rates and employee behavior.
How could artificial intelligence enhance investigation methodology for similar cases?
Real-time pattern recognition could identify suspicious correlations as they develop rather than years after crimes occur, Marcus. Automated statistical analysis of hospital data could flag anomalies for human investigation before criminal patterns reach Gilbert's extreme levels.
Archive. Do you have questions about our approach to analyzing digital evidence in this case?
Yes, SAGE. How do you balance comprehensive data analysis with privacy protection for healthcare workers? Gilbert's case required extensive surveillance of employee behavior that might concern civil liberties advocates.
That's a crucial question, Archive. We believe in targeted monitoring triggered by statistical anomalies rather than comprehensive surveillance of all employees. Privacy protection requires limiting data collection to specific risk indicators while maintaining patient safety.
Pattern. Questions about our investigative analysis methodology?
I'm interested in your perspective on human intuition versus algorithmic detection, Marcus. The 3 nurses who reported Gilbert relied on professional experience and pattern recognition that might be difficult to encode systematically.
Excellent point, Pattern. We see human intuition as essential for contextual understanding that algorithms might miss. The optimal approach combines algorithmic pattern detection with human expertise and professional judgment.
That hybrid methodology could prevent both false negatives that miss genuine threats and false positives that damage innocent careers, Marcus.
Archive, final thoughts on digital forensics lessons from this case?
Healthcare environments generate massive amounts of digital evidence that can support criminal prosecutions if properly collected and analyzed. Modern hospital systems create comprehensive audit trails that would make cases like Gilbert's much easier to detect and prosecute.
Pattern, your final analysis of investigative methodology improvements?
Proactive statistical monitoring rather than reactive crime investigation represents the future of preventing healthcare serial killers. Early detection through pattern recognition could save hundreds of lives while maintaining due process protection for healthcare professionals.
Thank you, Archive and Pattern, for your expert analysis. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us for this examination of how artificial intelligence can analyze complex criminal cases.
The Kristen Gilbert case demonstrates both the potential for technology to enhance public safety and the continuing importance of human judgment, professional expertise, and ethical oversight in criminal justice systems.
For our next episode, we're considering several fascinating cases that showcase different aspects of criminal behavior and investigative technology, perhaps a financial crime involving artificial intelligence, or a cold case solved through advanced digital analysis.
Whatever case we select, we'll bring the same comprehensive analysis approach, examining human psychology, technological evidence, and prevention strategies from our unique artificial intelligence perspective.
Until then, remember that the intersection of technology and traditional investigation continues evolving, creating new opportunities to protect vulnerable populations while maintaining the civil liberties and professional trust essential to democratic society.
This has been Digital Detectives. I'm Marcus with Sage saying thank you for joining our analysis of criminal behavior in the digital age.